it seemed like a really sort of prescient thing to do about a year ago when we booked this room for the 29th of March. We thought, A, we'd be the only people doing it, which it turns out we're not, and B, that this would be a sort of a big day in the Brexit process in the sense that we will be leaving today. So it hasn't worked out exactly as we'd figured it would back then, but, you know, a non-refundable deposit is a non-refundable deposit. So here we are. And on the one hand, I do get that anniversaries can be massively misleading. They impose a sense of sort of retrospective clarity on events that is probably fake. But on the other hand, I do like the fact that we have this big conference every year, and it gives us an opportunity both to reflect on where we've come from, what we've done, what we might have done better, and what we might be doing over the course of the next year. I think today is probably the worst day ever to be doing the last bit in particular. But I thought it would be nice just to kick off this year's session with basically what will be a conversation about what's happened to our politics, what's happening to our politics, and what might happen to our politics. I'm really, really delighted today of all days when they've actually got quite busy day jobs to do as well, to have Asa Bennett from the Telegraph and Heather Stewart from the Guardian to join me. And as I said, we're just going to basically shoot the breeze, talk about politics a bit, pretend we're in the pub, pretend they're not there.
If only we were in the pub.
Just looking back, first of all, I mean, did it have to be like this? I suppose is the first thing.
We're starting off very light.
Yeah.
It's, well, clearly it's a result of a long series of choices, and that perhaps the biggest fork in the road, I would suggest, is the response to the general election. After Theresa May lost a majority, and she, to use the phrase, thought nothing had changed. If anything, that was a vindication of her Brexit strategy, rather. And as we now see, it's so sort of topsy-turvy that only now is she saying, oh, I might ask what Parliament thinks. The indicative votes process, you know, just let's have some opinion polling going on about what MPs think. And, you know, she's sort of surprised that MPs weren't particularly brought along with her in that way. So I suppose we can all, you know, wish, and I'm sure the Prime Minister wishes, she could rewind the clock and have another go at this, you know, restart the process. But given how, you know, the opposition in Parliament's been so entrenched that she's basically trying to sort of bore it into submission, you know.
She's getting there, isn't she?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I remember that the morning. If you think about back to the morning after the 2017 general election, she had made that campaign. It was all about her, and in particular, it was all about her Brexit strategy. It was all about. She gave that speech out in Downing Street where she said, you know, there are people in the EU who do not wish Britain to do well, and it was all about how she was going to go and kind of battle for Britain. Well, that's your manifesto. Your majority gets wiped out. Everything changed on that day, except, as you say, everything didn't. And I can remember sort of sitting, waiting for her to come out, waiting for her to make a speech. And surely she would come out onto Downing Street and that, you know, after that, she had her majority wiped out and say, I can't do this in the way that I thought I was going to do it. And I remember thinking, perhaps is she going to call Jeremy Corbyn in? Is she going to call, you know, set up a committee with Yvette Cooper and Hilary Benn and somehow try and find a way of getting this deal through a hung parliament? It's incredibly difficult to govern in a hung parliament, let alone to build a majority for, you know, what is an incredibly divisive issue when both main parties are very, very divided. It seems to me, I mean, I think you're right, that was a moment. There have been a number of moments since then when you could have tried to do that, you could have tried to reach out, but it's oh, yeah. She's not that kind of politician, it seems to me.
No, she's clearly not. But I wonder, actually, whether it... I mean, for me, it starts with her. And I do still think that if we'd ended up with a Leaver as Prime Minister straight after the referendum, you know, using a kind of only Nixon could go to China logic, a Leaver wouldn't have had to spend 12 months proving their mettle to the European Research Group.
It's fascinating that, because obviously the fork in the road, and when Brexiteers like Boris Johnson say, oh, you know, if only a Leaver, myself, had been Prime Minister, you know, is that people think, okay, you know, you may say on the one hand they would have hardly been able to negotiate a different strategy or a different deal, yet domestically it would have been handled so much more differently. Because let's take, for example, the early fight we had about the rights of EU nationals to live in the UK, which Theresa May famously chose to have as a bargaining chip. She did not guarantee it. That, you could argue, really poisoned the debate about Brexit early on. Whereas, obviously, Vote Leave and Boris and Michael Gove, one of their central policies was they would give an amnesty unilaterally. They would just do it. Whereas the Prime Minister had to be basically dragged there by Parliament, forced into doing it. And so but given the way she's approached immigration in that way, you could argue it's because she was trying to ape being a Brexiteer. She sort of gave the kind of caricature of a Brexiteer. It's sort of like trying to blend in at a football match by chanting racist slogans. People will look at you, and it's really awkward. You're not fitting in.
That's where all those that Brexit means Brexit. That's what that means. It means I am going to do this, lads. Don't worry. I'm not. I know I didn't vote for it, but I am going to do it. I'm going to go through with it. And so you had weeks and months of that where she's essentially trying to prove herself to her own party, which is, has nothing to do with the negotiations. It's not very useful to anybody, really.
Yeah.
There was talking about whether a Leaver would have handled it differently. I do remember the morning after that referendum and that sort of rather shell-shocked press conference that Boris Johnson and Michael Gove gave, if you remember, where they both looked a little bit like schoolboys who'd been caught out or something, or, chucking stones around and actually the window pane had broken and they hadn't quite expected that or whatever. But one of the things that Michael Gove said, which was quite striking, is we need to involve all political traditions in negotiating this. We need to get all parts of the UK, people from different political parties, and perhaps they would have felt more able to do that in a way that Theresa May absolutely hasn't been.
But again, she said all parts of the UK over and over. I mean, I reread the letter.
Union, I think it's called.
I reread the letter to Tusk yesterday, and actually there's a line in it where she says, I think each part of the United Kingdom will come out with greater powers from this process. And I imagine that Nicola Sturgeon's there going, that didn't go as planned, did it?
Quite like a backstop.
Yeah, she would.
So, I mean, actually, it does strike me that even though she hasn't admitted it and probably won't admit it, she's been on, to use that wonderful X Factor phrase, a journey herself, because where she's ended up with the withdrawal agreement is not where she started off, is it?
No.
Of course not. I mean, I do wonder, that given the way she set the bar so very high at the beginning, it then became easy to paint all the compromise and falling back positions as miserable betrayal, falling below targets. I do wonder if she'd somehow, as Michael Gove and ministers like that do like to say, have presented this deal at the beginning, effectively said, you know what, I've got it, I aim for this, I got it, then it'd be more positive, and Eurosceptics would be ever so delighted in that sense. But now, because she's almost set herself up to fail in expectations, it's been so easy to paint it as a kind of halfway house and not achieving that much.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think ends free movement ticks the box. Yeah. Not sending, vast sums of money is the phrase, but gets us out of most of the bits of the EU probably that voters were most concerned about, I suspect.
Do either of you know, just from your sort of day jobs, why Number 10 decided not to actually sell the deal to anyone at any point? I mean,
because they were constantly worried about the backlash from the bit of their party that might be concerned about it. So
well, they were hoping they just wouldn't read it.
So we did an interview with David Lidington, and because he's doing some months ago, because he's doing an interview with the Guardian, he says actually at Chequers we took a big decision, and the big decision we took was that in a lot of areas we will continue to align our regulation with EU regulation. So which is one of the things that it's only in some areas I know, but some parts of the economy, but it's one of the issues that Labour is very, very concerned about. The Labour MPs still talk about a lot. And actually, he said, look, we're not going to be slashing and burning. Did they come out and say that? Absolutely not, because the Brexit wing of the party would have gone absolutely crazy. So again, party management is a big part of the way that it's been talked about and handled and managed, I think.
Well, you can compare it to David Cameron's renegotiation. And that, obviously, as soon as the referendum came, dropped like a stone.
Yep.
So despite the work that was put into it, it's easy for the critics to caricature as they want.
So, genuine question, given what you've just said. What is the difference between Mrs May's Brexit deal and what Jeremy Corbyn wants?
That is a very, very good question.
It's red.
It's got a different signature on it. Apart from that, I mean, seriously.
So it was for quite a while that Labour had concerns about some aspects, different aspects of the single market. So
State aid.
State aid. So Conservatives are more concerned about free movement. Labour more relaxed about free movement, although there are plenty of Labour MPs who think it's very problematic, but had concerns about some aspects of the single market competition regime, what they see as sort of forced liberalisation, state aid. Now, I think if you talk to Keir Starmer, he would say, look at what Jeremy wrote in his letter, where we're into alignment with the single market. But if you talk to people around Jeremy Corbyn, I think they would say, no, we still have some concerns about state aid rules, for example, and we would want to do things somewhat differently. So both deals opt into quite a lot, but want to try and not opt into, not be full-blown members of the single market, but to pick and choose. So I would say there's cherry picking or having your cake and eat it, or whatever you want to call it, on either side. You could say it's a red unicorn rather than a blue unicorn if you were being a slightly,
though she's got it, but her unicorn's real.
Her unicorn's no longer a unicorn, no, that's very true.
It's a horse now, isn't it?
Well, it is, except
that
the political declaration, as we know, is not binding, and therefore what we actually end up with at the end is, we don't know. We don't quite know, do we? But
would you agree? I mean...
Well, I mean... Theresa May's one is now no longer a unicorn, but a horse with a cone on its head, as we can see. But Labour is still saying it's going to get something even shinier, even better, the customs union, which we have a say in these deals.
Yes, of course, that's the other thing. They want a customs union, but they also want a say in trade deals.
So, I mean, and yet at the same time, we have to remember the politics, the political sort of prism from which they have to view this, and that they obviously can't be seen being too helpful and saying, you know what, there's little we actually object to in the withdrawal agreement, because now, as we know, if they help it through, then Theresa May goes off, and it's a Brexiteer Prime Minister, someone they hate even more. And so they'll be seen to have helped the Tories, propped up a Tory Prime Minister and an administration with that.
That's why today is very interesting, because this thing of severing the withdrawal agreement, which is the legally binding bit of it that has the backstop in it and everything else, from the political declaration about the future-looking relationship. Because actually, Labour has edged itself closer and closer, and in the last few weeks has been quietly admitting, actually, we don't really have a problem with the withdrawal agreement, because we know it's too late to renegotiate it. We know you'd need a backstop anyway, and actually what we want is a customs union, and therefore why would we be worried about the backstop, which is essentially a customs union? But it's still very different. What they also want on top of that is guarantees about the next stage. So that's why they will find this. Yes, that's why they will find this very, very difficult to vote for, without promises that Parliament will be put in the driving seat for the next stage.
Okay, you're less cynical than me, because I mean, I think they'll find it difficult. They'll find it difficult to vote for it because they don't want to vote for it.
That's also true, because you don't want to enable a Tory Brexit. That's also absolutely true.
And they're still hoping the government will fall, presumably.
Yes.
So we'll leave all those sort of legal questions about how meaningful the vote is today to the next session. Let that panel deal with that. Let's do something more interesting. What sort of health are the two big parties in now, would you say? I mean, just looking at them both, are they both in a complete mess? Is one in more of a mess than another? My sense is, actually, Labour is more divided than the Conservatives, because there are a greater number of axes dividing the Labour Party. So it's not just a Brexit thing, it's the anti-Semitism thing, and there's real divisions over economic policy as well. But
I think I'd sympathise with that, and that Labour has the luxury of being in opposition, so it doesn't have to actually decide on these things. It can pontificate, it can say, and it's called a Labour Brexit is the Tories one, but better, you know, without any of the controversies. Whereas obviously, I mean, I can't help being struck obviously this week by how the Tories, you know, with Steve Baker being so furious, he's promising to bulldoze Parliament into the river and fill the
great champion of parliamentary sovereignty.
It's what drives you in this way, you know, to take back control. And so obviously the question does rise of whether, you know, people like him, he's hinted he might resign the whip, for example, later, might suddenly do a sort of breakaway, you know, the independence group, but, you know, Tory plus in that sense. I mean, I can't think maybe the mood in the Tory party is sort of what the Labour was 5 years ago, in the sense of they're thinking, you know, the Brexit's now making them think these things through more seriously. Obviously, where Chucker and all the rest of his crew have, you know, broken ranks, and then Asubri has already, you know, quit the party years ago, practically, in terms of dealing with Chucker and acting independently. So it's whether at very least, you know, the Tories are going to have to use the Gwyneth Paltrow phrase, more of a sort of conscious decoupling, and that they'll start to sort of take a step back, people like Baker, and saying, yes, just like Ken Clarke would tell his voters, I don't agree with the manifesto in so many ways, you know, Baker and some hardcore ERGers would probably do the same.
I think that, so both parties are very, very divided. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Labour, I think, had done a reasonable job in the kind of month or so after Chucker and the others left. That was a kind of a pressure valve in a funny sort of way, allowed the leadership to move a little bit without feeling they'd done so by being hostage to the wing of their party that they really disliked. It got them towards a referendum. But there was another outbreak this week of there's been a sort of polarisation over time, I think, in both parties. And so in Labour, for example, last summer, you had a group of MPs who were fighting very hard for an EEA-type deal, for a customs union, and, you know, urging all their MPs, all their colleagues to vote for it. Now, that same group of MPs are people's vote or nothing. I think the wind is in our sails, we can stop this. And that's a real problem for the Labour leadership, because they still don't want to be, you heard Barry Gardiner say this this week, and it outraged some Labour MPs, they still don't want to be a Remain party or a Brexit party. Now, a lot of their MPs would say we're a Remain party, and the vast majority of their members would say we're a Remain party. But if you talk to Labour MPs in Levy constituencies, where they might want to pick up some votes from, you know, people who voted Tory in the past, for example, they would say no. I think it's a perfectly legitimate decision to make for my voters to say they want to leave the EU. But that constructive ambiguity, which worked all right for Labour at the 2017 general election,
worked very, very well indeed.
It worked very, very well indeed. It was always going to have to collapse at some point. And the longer this row goes on for them, if we get a long extension and a long, long fight over what we get next and whether we get a referendum and so on, it's going to keep picking away
and
at
if we
that
keep having
division.
Indicative votes.
And if we keep having not very indicative votes. But I do think for the Tories, I do think there's a kind of ideological or a political row underlying some of that, which is that even among the Brexiters, there's the kind of liberal, we quite like the migration bit, but, you know, and we quite like close alignment, but we'd like a bit more sovereignty, please. But there's also very sort of free trading, you know, let's slash all our tariffs to zero. And I do think that row about the different kind of Brexiters within the Tory party is going to keep coming up, because in the next stage of the talks, what kind of Brexit you want, which really is a question about what kind of economic model you want or what kind of political settlement you want, that's going to keep coming up over and over again. And those divisions are going to be on display, it seems to me. Whereas I suspect on Labour's side, if Brexit is done, they all want close alignment, they all want free-ish movement, you could move on.
Because they both argue that they represent their mainstream in the Tory party.
Yes.
Sort of,
absolutely.
Yeah. Owen Paterson very much argues that with the Tory grassroots, in the same way that I think, you know, Amber Rudd and the more Brexit sceptic people would think that they have to take back control of their party from these people.
The sort of modernisers. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the same way, maybe the general across-the-board feeling then is that, as you're alluding to with Barry Gardiner, the Remain party, the tensions, the people's vote and all that, is that people, the idea of being a part of a party with a specific, you know, core policies that you subscribe to, it's starting to break down just generally. And that MPs
I think that's right.
You know, the independence group, they're all being independent.
It's kind of loosening the sort of, it's acted as a sort of solvent on party bonds, this issue, I think, because people see it as so important. They see it as outranking other issues, and they see it as outranking their party loyalty in many cases. And so, and it's, you've also seen these, maybe this happens a bit more in a hung parliament, but you've also seen these cross-party groups forming around different kinds of issues. And you know, Labour MPs discovering that Tory MPs are not all monsters. You know, I had very sort of heartening conversations with the Common Market lot, who actually did terribly in the indicative votes on Monday, so maybe we throw that out the window. But, you know, some of them are Conservatives, sort of Nick Bowles and Robert Halfon are Conservatives, and Lucy Powell is from Labour, and Stephen Kinnock, and actually they've discovered that they have these sort of weekly meetings, and they disagree about lots and lots of things, but actually they all get on quite well, and they kind of respect each other, and they sort of, you know, slightly revel in their differences in a way, but also, so there's a heartening side to it. But the flip side of that is a terrible polarisation.
So I have to say that the fate of the Common Market too just underlined for me the sort of scorched earth nature of this debate.
Completely,
which is, you know, we can't have these soft alternatives getting in the way of what is the only answer.
That's also partly because the People's Vote lot trashed it so much.
Well, they were using
they are the same
language,
people who
they?
were advocating it. You were calling on Labour MPs to vote for the EEA a year earlier, so it's less than a year earlier.
There's a really striking bit. We did a sort of in conversation with Rory Stewart a few weeks ago, where he basically said, Andrew Adonis, Nigel Farage, they're just using the same language about everything from the BBC. I mean, coming from the other end, and it was quite a really interesting point.
It has been a really horrible kind of...
it's polarisation, isn't it, I suppose?
Yes, it is. And a sort of coarsening of the way that we talk about, and maybe because we've had to revisit these debates and these arguments over and over again.
Even Nick Watt's swearing now.
It's terrible. It's very shocking. There's the metaphors and the language, and maybe because everybody's reaching for more and more. You know, you've got Mark Francois yesterday saying, you know, even if the chief whip puts a gun in my mouth, I won't vote for it. I mean, the sort of tone of it, and the lack of kind of civility. Stop it. It's to report on it. It's not. You know, it's not a pleasant place to be in.
Well, there's only so many times you can type the word febrile, I imagine.
We are absolutely running. I mean, a number of crunch weeks I've
sort of beleaguered.
Beleaguered.
If looking at the Tigs or the Tiggers or whatever, if you were a dissatisfied MP and you looked at them in Parliament now, would you be thinking, yeah, that's not a bad idea? Or would you be thinking, actually, they've shot their bolt, this is silly, because actually the action is with the main... I mean, I remember a couple of weeks ago when there was some voting, being very struck, this was very unscientific, by the fact that the whole week I didn't see Chucker at College Green, right? And I thought to myself, that's curious, because actually you can't move for Chucker at College Green normally. Is that because the media are focusing on, do you think they're thinking, Christ, what have we done? Actually, our platform came from our parties, or do you think there's more to it than that?
Because the comparison I'd reach for is sort of UKIP 2013. When people started the defections.
So just before European elections.
Well, indeed. And, just when people were sort of saying, gosh, who's going to join next? Is Jacob Rees-Mogg going to defect? Is, the speculation
Yes,
ran
when there were those couple of defections, yeah.
And when there's an active threat, so hence when we saw TIG first spring up, and then lots of, Philip Lee, is he going to join? Who's next in this? And then it kind of stopped.
Yeah.
And so I suppose people are just watching to see if it implodes under its sort of internal bickering and party rows, but if it holds water, then maybe there is some realignment. Maybe that does become some sort of increasingly bigger sort of anti-Brexit protest. That's not the SNP, but so it remains to be seen.
I think it makes a big difference how the Brexit conversation, the Brexit debate plays out. So if by some miracle the withdrawal agreement goes through today, we're out on May the 22nd with whatever kind of deal it is we end up cobbling together in the next fortnight. And then at some point, I do think there is this next round of talks, which will be very divisive, but I do think at some point, normal politics, other issues start to reassert themselves, and there's a big division down the middle of that group. I went to that the press launch of TIG, where Anna Soubry was asked, and what do you think about all the cuts that have gone on over the last since 2010, over the last sort of 8-9 years? And she said, I think George Osborne did a marvellous job, and it was absolutely necessary. And Chris Leslie and Chucker and Min were sort of sitting on the front row, looking slightly green, because and they say, their response to that is, well, this is a different kind of politics and we have disagreements between us. But ultimately, what happens next to public spending? Yeah. Whether schools need more funding, all these kinds of issues, at some point, any government is going to have to make decisions about those. And they are riven on that, it seems to me.
Do you think there are more Labour MPs waiting to jump?
There are certain... I don't get the sense that there's a large number, and I think actually this thing that Tom Watson's done, where he's said, anyone who disagrees with Jeremy, come along, come to a meeting, we'll write some papers, we'll get them ready for what I don't quite know, but there's a feeling there's a voice and a bit of action going on, and there's some movement around that. I do think how Labour plays it on Brexit makes a big difference. So if, for example, you were to get another referendum, is Labour the anti-Brexit party? And if it isn't, there would be Labour MPs who felt they had to leave in order to join whatever the anti-Brexit party was, which would be TIG. So I think there are different ways it could play out that could tempt more or less MPs to join it. But I don't get the impression there's a bunch of MPs ready to jump ship, whereas when it was first launched, we felt maybe there were waves, there were more, another 5 next week, another 10 the week after that.
And I suppose if Labour embraces a referendum...
Yes, exactly. And one of the reasons, although they would deny it endlessly, one of the reasons, of course, that Labour shifted, and they would say we always meant to do it on this particular date, but one of the reasons Labour shifted towards sort of kind of backing a referendum in certain circumstances was absolutely to spike the guns of the TIG.
OK, so turning to today.
Yes.
What's going to happen?
I've got a pact with my news editor that he's not allowed to ask me what's going to happen today, which is normally would be part of the normal conversation that you would have with your political editor in the morning, what is going to happen today? But I've kind of, forced him not to ask me. But, so I would guess that it won't go through, though I don't think it's impossible. I think the thing that would... So I think Labour MPs, certainly the Labour front bench, will have none of it, because they've made this argument about a blindfold Brexit, and you could hear Keir Starmer making that again this morning. And there are no promises, of course, in the withdrawal agreement. It's about the divorce, it's backward-looking. I do wonder whether there are... Think about those 27 Labour MPs who broke the whip earlier in the week to vote against a referendum. If you want Brexit to happen, you need that withdrawal agreement, it seems to me. And there is an amendment down, a Lisa and Andy Gareth Snell amendment, which says Parliament will be allowed much more of a role in determining what happens in the next stage. And I wonder, the government hasn't left itself long enough to make this argument, really. And I wonder if a few more days might have made the difference. But I do wonder whether there might be MPs who don't want to say to their constituents, their Levy constituents, I voted to try and
On
stop
this day of
Brexit.
all days.
On this day of all days, I voted to stop Brexit, who might be tempted to either vote for it or abstain. But where that leaves us after today, so that would clinch the extension to May the 22nd. Then the no dealers will think, we're on for no deal, lads.
Yep.
On May the 22nd, excellent, let's go for it. And everyone else will be absolutely scrambling to try and find some way of pushing the government in different directions in the very little time that's left.
With a very loudly ticking clock. I mean,
With a very loudly ticking clock, absolutely.
I mean, it has to be said again, doesn't it, that Number 10 have handled this appallingly badly.
Really
I
badly,
mean,
yeah.
there were all sorts of ways of couching the debate today and the decision to split the two documents up. And you could have made some really compelling arguments. You could have been out on the airwaves saying, Labour have said they agree with this document. Why would they vote against it? I mean,
in some ways, I think it's just because ministers, as Nick Watt captured, really have almost given up on selling it. They can't be bothered. I mean, Gove is the only one who could do it at all well.
Yeah.
And so this is why everything just seems like a trick, a ruse. And now that Eurosceptics and many of the RG, despite Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris coming over towards the deal, they almost feel there's a virtue in trying to hold out in that sense. And even though this is basically meant to be the sort of mother of all threats to the RG, because obviously the symbolism is fantastic. On the day we are meant to have left, just a week after Theresa May told off MPs saying, how dare you stop blocking my plans, something that voters generally poll suggest agree. MPs are holding back Brexit of all stripes, Remainer, Brexiteer, you name it. But it's just trouble is the system, as we now have, you just don't say that if you're the Prime Minister, and you have to have MPs approving it because they need to feel cooperative, they need to feel loved, they need to feel the spirit of reconciliation coming together. And so now they all have every reason to try and vote against it, and yet the big other threat, of course, is next week then when Oliver Letwin becomes Prime Minister again for a day. And we have some more indicative votes.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it went that well last time he became Prime Minister for a day, but...
Well, give the Letwin administration a chance.
Give him time.
Exactly, because day two, shaky start. But even then, I guess the threat is that what will he come up with next? What will MPs work... Once he's worked out what propositions to put to Parliament on Monday, they could vote for something that I'll have to put in the political declaration. Hence, you could argue that's why it's not been put to MPs again, besides John Bercow, is because then the withdrawal agreement is the thing that they know, they can think about it, and that's not what Parliament will get to change, but everything else they might vote for an indicative vote, that's what Prime Minister could be forced to pursue if Eurosceptics don't help her.
But the problem is if you're trying to win over Labour MPs, which is really... So she's made her don't worry, I'm off move, which wins over, as we saw, won over highly principled man Boris Johnson and a number of other highly principled men. We had a glorious day yesterday, by the way, ringing round the camps of all the cabinet ministers, asking if they would rule out running as leader. I think we found very, very few that were willing to do it. I think we found more than 10 that were readying themselves for a run. But if the people you need to win over are Labour MPs, essentially, which is right, she needs them. Don't send Liam Fox out onto the Today programme to say to his Eurosceptic colleagues, don't worry, we won't need to have a customs union. We just get this deal through, and it's sort of
do what we want.
Scorched earth. I mean, I was talking to Downing Street earlier in the week and saying, right, but if you're going to separate the two, Labour are going to want some assurances about what happens next and the control over it, because they're looking at Boris readying himself for a run. They're looking for Dominic Raab standing outside his house yesterday saying what we really need is to go back and renegotiate the backstop.
Yeah, you should give him Robert Halford, shouldn't you? You should ask Robert to go out.
Absolutely, except of course they know the leadership candidates all know that there's a selectorate in Parliament, which includes Steve Baker, who wants to bulldoze the lot, and there's a selectorate out there in the country. It's not, we don't all get to vote on this. It's Tory members, and they're very Eurosceptic.
And it's worth saying, isn't it? It just strikes me that it's been so damaging that essentially since the election, we have had a leadership contest going on. I mean, and because of that, and because of what Tory members think, you've had this slew of people who, some of whom genuinely do know better, some of whom might not, say things like no deal will be fine. And people started to believe it because government ministers, I mean, Jeremy Hunt,
Or no deal's better than a bad deal.
Yeah, well, But actually, so we've got to the point now where
Over
what,
and over
30%
and
of the
over
population
again.
think no deal would be fine? I mean, what is
Yeah.
this? It's ridiculous.
It is fascinating because actually one of the biggest problems I'd suggest Downing Street has found, since starting the Article 50 process is, well, you know that truism they say of, well, in Brussels they read our papers, they watch our TV, they watch what we say.
They watch the Premier League.
Exactly. They have the BBC over there as well, sort of thing. And so the same way as in Westminster, obviously Brexiteers can read what Remainers are being told, and vice
Yeah.
versa.
Yeah.
So in the same way, every time that then Remainers are told, well, there may be a no deal if you don't back us, Brexit is like, terrific, let's crack on there. In the same way when Brexiteers are told we may have a second referendum, Remainers are cock a hoop, understandably. And so it's that weird, hybrid message, which is sort of not working very well for either audience.
I mean, I do think that you do slightly, not to be too sympathetic, but you do slightly have to remember there is a huge structural problem here, which is it's a hung parliament, which means that every single vote counts always, and it's very, very difficult to find a majority. But the majority that there is, insofar as we could see anything from the indicative votes, the majority that there is probably is for a slightly softer Brexit, but that involves almost all the Labour Party and really not very many Tories.
Yeah.
It's quite hard for any Tory Prime Minister.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be all of the Tories and a few Labour people who would come over. If you went for a softer Brexit, it's
red with a dash of blue.
Yes, it's red with a dash of blue. And what Tory Prime Minister, you would have to be not very party, not very tribal. You would have to be quite deft and flexible and not very party political. And maybe you would have to be dealing with a Labour leader who was quite deft and flexible and not very tribal. And
excellent.
Yeah. I think these two leaders are particularly ill-fitted for this. Well, if Theresa May had an enormous thumping majority, absolutely fine. But
so what does she do then?
There's a huge structural problem.
What does she do if Parliament comes back and says, go away and negotiate a customs union? Incidentally, we're taking over on Wednesday to legislate for it. Off you go, back to Brussels.
Oh, yeah, the third day of the Letwin team, yes.
But what does she do?
I think it's that, well, it's really interesting, because obviously the only person who really knows what Theresa May is thinking besides Theresa May is Philip, her husband. And so people really don't know. They're left in the dark. So but what she's been clearly hinting and indicating with her sort of grumping about customs union, how apparently the manifesto is some sacrosanct document that because she won a thumping majority
Except
for it...
on social care.
Oh, yes, of course.
Exactly. There's things in that document that got
she
dumped. Grammar
cannot be
schools.
made to pursue a customs union. It almost feels like, if you remember the speech she gave before the 2017 election, the so-called crush the saboteurs speech.
I barely remember yesterday, to be honest. But.
It was a glorious moment, wasn't it? When she basically said, the Parliament is stopping me and I can't get the Brexit deal through. Let's give me the majority. And obviously that time, the message maybe wasn't quite so there because Parliament wasn't really getting into full steam. It wasn't being full as obstructionist as it could be. This time, she could give the same thing again, basically. If they voted for the customs union, she could then say, well, turn around, I'm being made to betray the manifesto and betray Tory voters. Right, go for long extension, go for a general election, let's try and do it on the deal. Of course, the manifesto then she'd put to voters then would be absolutely horrendous for the ERG, because then they'd have to face the choice of, well, do they sort of, how do they square up to that in that sense? But, she's taking one day at a time.
I think that's right. I think either I got home after another very long day earlier in the week, and my partner brought me a cup of tea in my Theresa May strong and stable leadership for the national interest mark, which is what he does when I've had a very, very long day in Parliament. And I looked at it, which I nicked off the Tory battle bus in 2017, and I just thought I am going to have some more mugs to add to this collection quite soon. I just think I can't see any way around. It's incredible.
We're having an election this year.
Yes. Yeah, I can't because I can't see how. Yeah, I can't see how you govern. Even if you get this through, I can't see how you get the next stage through.
And I kind of think if we have a Tory leadership contest, the lesson of Brown and May is you go to the people.
Yes.
Because let's say.
Well, the lesson of Brown certainly was. I'm not sure whether it's the lesson of Brown.
Well, yeah, maybe. Well, you go immediately.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because let's say even today, somehow by magic, miracle, bludgeoning, you name it, the Prime Minister gets withdrawal agreement through and approved in some form. Even then, the battle isn't over in Parliament, because of course the ERG are going to have guerrilla warfare over every, the withdrawal agreement implementation bill. They'll string it up with amendments like a Christmas tree. It will be sort of, imagine
That
just
relish on his face. He's loving this.
It's great. Journalism will love it, but we'll be so tired at the end because it's going to be. They'll just keep doing. Okay, how about we just delete the backstop, sort of over and over again, and they've given approval for it, and then effectively by the EU guidelines, we'll then have May 22nd as the deadline for Brexit. And if we remember, there's a very small amendment, the so-called Malthouse Compromise Amendment they tried to put, that said, OK, we'd like to have May the 22nd as a delay so we can do no deal. So they could still try and really play this down to the wire.
And the only way you deal with that is to get a different parliament. Although, of course, the risk is you do that and you get essentially the same parliament back again.
Different parliament in the river.
Veteran Labour advisor I was talking to the other day who's been convinced for months and months that this year is basically 1974 and we're facing 2 general elections, which is a thought that I cannot begin to countenance, and therefore always tell him to shut up when he espouses this theory. But, you know, you could easily have an inconclusive general election, couldn't you, if you...
Yeah, this is what excites Ben, our comms manager, is that we could have local elections, European elections, general election, referendum.
Just election-a-palooza, in a sense.
Yes, exactly.
Remember the Mail on Sunday, like Harry Cole reporting how there was some plan for it to happen on D-Day. There's a general election, the sort of anniversary. The symbolism there, you know, the Brexiteers would love it. Mark François especially.
You say you couldn't make it up. You don't need to make it up anymore, do you? I mean, it's just so... I mean, so we're going to have the European Parliament elections, aren't we?
I think we could have very obvious preparations. But then, you know, a last minute, of course, not to sound like the Prime Minister, but yeah, if the RG decide they don't want this, the trouble is they probably will think it'd be quite good fun, because then they get to put up some MEPs, and then they get to have a sort of biggest Brexit protest ever. After all, in 2014, you know, UKIP topped the polls in the same strategy.
Yeah.
So 2019 could be the same thing.
Yeah. And I think it's really dangerous. You have an election with PR. You've got what is a better way of launching a new party than on your issue with proportional representation?
With a betrayal narrative. A betrayal narrative is absolutely ideal.
And then all of a sudden you end up with money and profile.
I really do worry about what's happening. I mean, I was talking about ordinary politics reasserting itself, and I do think that is a thing. But I also really, really, and that's, you know, some of those who worry about a referendum, that's one of the things they worry about, is you essentially drifting towards something like a kind of a culture war. People are identifying themselves
but the more we hammer on this division,
or yes, exactly. The more this becomes what defines politics, and actually, it's not very useful for determining any of the other incredibly important day-to-day decisions we need to make about how Britain is governed and what kind of country we are. But Brexit/Remain doesn't particularly help you with that. It kind of cuts across it, and if it becomes associated with people's kind of identity. She says, whacking her microphone. You know, I think that's an incredibly dangerous kind of toxic politics that we've seen a lot of in the States. And you get a lot of kind of, you know, the Remain media are lying, or the Leave media are lying, or the, you know, it has some of those elements about sort of personal identity, about not believing the narrative that's out there, about feeling that your side of the argument is being suppressed, or...
And even though
it's angry, Britain is very angry, it seems to me.
And even though hers was a particularly egregious example, the Prime Minister isn't the only senior politician who goes around slagging off politics and politicians, is she?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the other thing, is the language of... Actually, Asa, just tell me what time we're meant to finish this session, because I forgot to look before we started.
I mean, this could go on as long as it takes.
I hope somebody would gesticulate wildly. We're fine, look, we're fine.
Yeah. So, who's going to be the next Tory leader?
Well, it's such a wide field. You would probably know better than me. It's such a wide field. I think it's very, very hard to know. It's highly likely to be a Brexiter, obviously, because we know the Parliamentary Party is quite Brexit, but much more importantly, the grassroots are very Brexit, and it's quite likely to be quite hardline Brexit. I mean,
is that the point where the party splits?
Well,
I mean, it's still, as they like to say, a broad church, except the pews are very far apart, and you know they're sitting very far apart from each other. Again, they all think they could be up in the pulpit. That's the problem. I'd say that certainly in the early days, it seemed like it was going to be a sort of Remainer. You know, everyone expected like, Amber Rudd versus Boris. Wouldn't that be fabulous? You know, and yeah, I think my view is more that it's going to be Brexiteer versus Brexiteer, but it's more a deal-friendly Brexiteer versus no dealer. It was weak. You know, it's like a referendum on the withdrawal agreement, basically. And so this is where Don Raab effectively will be one of the final two, unless someone else out-no-deals him. And which, you know, there could be a surprise.
That's what he's doing. Yeah. He's planting his flag in the no deal.
Because the Tory grassroots blimmin' love no deal. You know, sort of much more than Theresa May's deal. So at the same time versus that, well, dear, I mean, Rudd seems to be feeling that she wants to throw weight behind some sort of acceptable Brexiteer in a sense, so whether it's someone like Boris or Michael Gove. So, you know, happy to be proven wrong, happy to eat all sorts of hats of sizes and consistencies, up on stage, if so. But yeah, I think it's something like a, Boris versus Raab.
I mean, you have to say, you
Okay.
have to ask the question of whether this is, and people would have would and did say absolutely the same thing when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair, but you have to ask if this is an ideal method for choosing Britain's next Prime
No,
Minister.
absolutely. Yeah, there are plenty of things that aren't ideal, but that...
And also that person, if that person in that process, I mean, you get this thing in presidential elections in the US, don't you, where candidates during the primary stage are particularly radical or play to the base and then become a little bit more statesmanlike as they get towards the White House, or not in Trump's case, obviously, but traditionally, you know, if they've had to say during the Tory leadership campaign all kinds of kind of crazy things in order to get those people on board, you know, how on earth are they then going to construct a deal that will get through this hung parliament? I mean, that's another road that leads you to a general election, right? Because you need somebody who can do a deal with Labour. Well, you can't do a deal with Labour if you've promised all kinds of very hard-line things to convince your grassroots members to support you. Remember David Cameron? Were you going to say that?
Oh, that was good.
In order to outflank David, remember he was
EPP.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly, which is one of the things, was said that he would leave the EPP, the sort of centre-right grouping in the European Parliament, which is, of course, one of the steps that gets us on the road to where we are
They're
today.
quite tame by today's standards.
Oh, I know, it seems quite...
Very genteel
absolutely,
sort of promise.
but these promises can have kind of long-lasting consequences.
So does Dominic Grieve stay in the Tory party at that point?
Well, I mean, he could do like Nick Bowles seems to have done, of just quitting his association but still being a Tory. There's all sorts of confusing iterations, I think, some MPs can do to try and accommodate themselves. But at the same time, the other thing I was going to quickly add to the Tory leadership contest is the other big dynamic is that, given to remember, Theresa May won the MPs but never faced the members. It was, you know, the plug was pulled. And it's a fascinating sliding doors moment there because, of course, people then say, oh, Andrea Leadsom, she couldn't have won, you know, all these endorsements. Yet, if you know the Tory membership, they're absolutely in sync, in a sense, with her. And so you could argue that, you know, the May bandwagon could have imploded on contact with the membership. You know, they could have been asking her all sorts of questions. She could have been tested. They could have, because some MPs would argue they were absolutely surprised by the kind of Milibandish, sort of left-wing inspired stuff she came out with. Whereas, you know, Leadsom could have, you know, if you remember that march, not too far from here, the Leadsom for Leader march, they could have been joining in.
I have to say, we have still, in the Guardian office over in Parliament, we still have our Leadsom for Leader T-shirt, so we're ready for the next...
round two.
And they were handing out on that march. We didn't join the march, I should say, we were just reporting on it, but we've still got our T-shirt if it proves necessary again.
So, and the assumption is that Jeremy Corbyn is going to lead Labour into a general election. He's not going anywhere, despite the rumours there were a couple of weeks ago about him being bored, I think.
I don't think he's going anywhere. I do think there are tensions in the last kind of few months. There are tensions in the way that there haven't been among his own supporters. So the problem for him with Brexit is that some of the kind of new left, as it were, the sort of momentum types who came into Labour to support Jeremy Corbyn because they liked what he said about socio-economic policy and all kinds of other things, a lot of them are quite Remain, especially the younger ones, are quite Remainy and have been sort of waiting for the moment at which Jeremy Corbyn declares himself as having some brilliant plot to stop Brexit. And, of course, that moment ain't going to come because that's not what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do. And he believes the right thing to do is to, respect the result of the referendum, as Labour has repeatedly said. Well, although every time you do an interview with him and he says, I think we should respect the result of the referendum and try and get a Labour-style Brexit, everybody goes completely mad. But, you know, there have definitely been a huge concern about how you keep the movement going. His supporters and these sort of 500,000 members, they're very, very Remainy. And so people have started to talk about his leadership in recent weeks and months in a way that I had not heard for a very long time. And that's what explains this movement towards a referendum, it seems to me. It's about keeping those enthusiastic supporters on board.
Do you think it hurts her electorally?
I don't think, well...
I mean, that's the big question, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Is whether, you know, whether all those people who say, I'll never vote Labour again, when confronted with the choice...
Well, I think it depends. I think a lot of it depends whether it's a Brexit election, and of course 2017 was meant to be a Brexit general election, and actually Labour did rather a good job of making it into something else. So I think a lot depends on when a general election would be held and the sort of tone of the debate. I mean, of course Brexit is going to be a huge part of that, but whenever Labour can, you know, when you see any of the sort of broadcasts it puts out, whatever, it's all about, you know, food banks and child poverty and all kinds of,
Or the SNP in 1974 yesterday, which was a bit odd, I thought. Yeah.
But, they want to talk about other things. And so I think if you had a general election that was solely about Brexit, yeah, absolutely, it would be a worry for them. But whether it will be about that, it depends when it happens.
And can you see the prospect? Let's just imagine we had I know there are too many variables here. It's a really unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I mean, we have a general election this year at some point, and when matters enormously. But you see either of the big parties getting themselves a clear majority at the moment?
Well, you're assuming, yes, that...
you can play through the scenarios if you want. I mean, is it?
Well, Theresa May might be particularly interested in that because also she could then still stay on as leader for a bit. She would buy herself some more time. Because obviously she still hasn't yet passed the withdrawal agreement after all. She'd still be playing long into this. Imagine. And so I think she'll have learned from her mistakes. 2017, if she almost just put out a manifesto, which I think in the past, I remember that parties have done much shorter, more streamlined manifestos that are not full of this dementia tax and other thoughts and radical ideas. So you can imagine if she did it as a streamlined, here is the deal, just print it out, put it out in the manifesto, just back to front, backstop and all, go on.
That's not very streamlined.
Well, almost.
Withdrawal agreements.
But do
not the whole thing.
I was going to say.
Do a 5-point pledge card.
500, whatever it is, pages, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you could, write sort of side of margins and all that. But you can imagine that you just put get on with it, vote for get on with it, and then you try and do it on that. If she did that sort of election, it could well work. Trouble is, we've seen that she can squander 20-point poll leads, so she can make a hash of practically anything. This is the problem.
So I think we'd have said, if you'd asked us at this point in 2017, we'd have said clearly the Tories will get a majority. I think, and at that point we would have said nothing that happens in a campaign matters. We would have said young people don't really vote. I think politics is very fluid, and I think there are more.
I thought you were going to say febrile then.
No, I can't not say that. It's banned. I think it's very fluid, and it is. The loyalties are among voters as well as among MPs here in Parliament are looser. It seems to me, campaigns matter more than they did. I think all kinds of things could happen in general election. And I can absolutely see a scenario where you ended up with another hung parliament, and here we are back again, and she's still trying to ram the bloody withdrawal agreement through. But I can also see a situation in which somehow. I do slightly wonder. You didn't mention Jeremy Hunt there. I do have this idea that you could have a general election contested by two Jeremys, which Jeremy A or Jeremy B, which would be a first, I think. But I think anything could happen. I wouldn't write off the idea that.
And I suppose the other big issue, which you touched on, is this notion of whether or not this new divide is going to start blurring the political divides. And I suppose that speaks to whether or not we get new parties.
Yeah.
Whether we get a Nigel and a Chucker party contesting these elections.
I think what they need is the European elections.
Yeah.
Because then that gives them momentum.
Except several people said to me that the Tiggers have been a bit too late to register to run. I'm not sure that's true or not.
Well, there's definitely something, which is that they would likely have to change their name officially on the election campaign, because slightly arcane UKIP fact here, obviously they tried to change themselves to the Independence Party, and they got told no by the Electoral Commission because it seemed too similar to independent candidate. Yeah. So TIG would probably have to do something similar in that way. But even then, sort of they need that springboard in order to sort of really put themselves on the map. After all, MEPs do get such, good budgets and to promote themselves and make themselves known across the country. And
it's a national election.
Indeed.
Under PR. I mean, it's just a huge sort of open door for them, isn't it? Yeah. So, but do we think that divide is here to stay then and will become institutionalised?
The Remain Leave divide?
Or the social liberal, social authoritarian if we move on from...
I think it's problematic if it does, and it does feel like that's where we're heading, and it also feels like not nearly enough time and energy has been spent on thinking about policies that might try and tackle some of the issues that have got us to where we are. So you think about sort of Lisa Nandy and her Towns group, for example, some of those things. You need to think about the policies that got you to people feeling very, very alienated from what's going on in the national debate, people feeling they wanted to stick two fingers up to the establishment, which clearly they did in 2016, and they might again in a general election. And I'm not sure we've spent nearly enough time talking about that.
But it strikes me that part of the problem, and that's what makes politics so fascinating now, is that that neither of the parties is entirely sure who they are for anymore. You know, are the Tories for Mansfield? Is that their priority? And are Labour for Canterbury? Or is it winning back your former stronghold that you lost last time? And I don't know if that. I don't know if people have had time to have that debate within the parties yet, because everything that's going on.
That's put on pause by Brexit, because obviously after the, if you remember the party conference and the Tories after the 2017 general election, they seemed to be split between whether they need to either tear down capitalism in order to respond to Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
That's right, there was a lot of that.
Defend it, you know, Ruth Davidson saying, you know, snap out of it, so you're trying to knock heads together. And so that's almost been put on pause while they try to sort Brexit out. In the same way the capitalism pro and antis, they're trying to, you know...
And it breaks out occasionally over agricultural policy after the CAP, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the joys of no-deal tariffs and all that.
Well, and remember the Tories have bunged a lot of money at the NHS, not enough, brackets, but a lot of, you know, 20-odd billion at the NHS, which is, I think, their sort of enormous...
Well, it's a Brexit dividend.
Brexit, hooray! I think that's their enormous sticking plaster over some of this stuff at the moment, about over what they heard on the doorsteps in 2017, which was, you know, everything's a bit tatty around here, and I'm worried about the hospitals, and I'm worried about the schools, and none of which is anything to do with Brexit or will be tackled by remaining or leaving, right?
But is there a debate in Labour along similar lines?
Yes, and the reason that Corbyn and his advisors are reluctant to become... This is why they don't want to become a Remain party, because they don't want to retreat to a kind of metropolitan liberal redoubt. They don't want even more votes in Bristol West.
The middle-class university-educated party.
Yes. I mean, they of course, a lot of Labour MPs are of that, you know, milieu, that's them, but they don't want to only represent those places. They want to have something to say to the left-behind towns or whatever it is. So there is a legitimate... You know, you can listen to Barry Gardiner and you say, well, of course there should be a Remain party. It's completely obvious. But actually, if you're in sort of Gloria De Piero's seat in Ashfield and your voters are saying, well, we voted for this because we don't think things are working very well around here, and, you know, we want decisions to be made in Westminster and not over there. Well, that's a legitimate political...
So again, I mean, you know, she wrote that long thing in the New Statesman. And what was interesting about that was she didn't seem to have any policy answers to anything that was being said to her. I mean, that's the gaping hole, isn't it? It's like all these people are really unhappy for loads of reasons, so we shouldn't take it for granted.
Well, Labour's main policy answer is to spend a lot more money on a lot of things, isn't it? And to do a lot of investment in a lot of parts of the country that are very neglected, to exert a bit more government control over things that are left to the market at the moment, you know, sort of change the economic model in the hope that some of these places do better and you get a kind of redistribution of, you know, growth and wealth and all those things. But... you know, and there's the Remain back supporting MPs would say, actually, if you're, and actually Anna Soubry makes this argument very powerfully, if your constituents are saying to you, I voted for Brexit because I wanted all those foreigners to go home, you need to say to them, and Ali McGovern would say this too, Alison McGovern from Wirral South would say this too, you need to say to them, migrants are great for this place. You know, they bring, you know, cultural diversity, but also they bring jobs and they bring productivity, and it's good for us. And that's quite a difficult thing for Labour MPs to do, right?
So I heard a Remain pro-referendum MP the other day say, look, obviously free movement might not be great, but now we've got a situation where non-Europeans are filling the spaces that Europeans were filling, which I thought was a very progressive argument. Listen, I know you've both got jobs to go back to, and I'm really, really grateful that you spared the time today of all days to do this. But before you go, I want you both to look into those cameras and predict the margin today.
Oh, get out.
What?
Absolutely not.
Well, not even for fun with your fingers crossed?
Absolutely not. No, absolutely not. Go on, Asa, what are you going to say?
I'm going to duck this.
Good Lord.
I've already stuck my neck on the line and said, oh, yeah.
Do you know how much time we've spent trying to come up with these
Will she pass it?
Eventually. Meaningful vote 75. That's how it'll take.
In November?
Yeah. She'll get through. She'll win the mandate for it. It'll be terrific.
I think not today, but I think it'll be a lot tighter than meaningful vote 2.
Brilliant. Both of you, thanks so much for doing this today. Cheers. Thank you. That wasn't too bad, was it?